Hello everybody and welcome to this video in which I'm looking at Sony, not any particular game within Sony's library, but just Sony as a general game publisher, because things have changed with Sony over the last couple of years in terms of what the company publishes and what it looks to create. And I would suggest that it's not for me as much as it used to be. I am still a very big fan of Sony's PlayStation console, and I enjoy an awful lot of Sony's games. But I feel like where Sony was towards the second half of the PlayStation 3 and the first half of the PlayStation 4 was more in line with the kinds of games that I like to play. So I wanted to do this video to, I guess, look at what Sony was back then and what we've lost a little bit in the years since, as Sony's changed its direction a bit in terms of the games that it publishes. So one of the big bits of news that came out of Gamescom a couple of weeks ago was that Sony was acquiring Insomniac Games, the very talented developer behind Spider-Man and a whole bunch of games before it was producing games exclusively for the PlayStation and for Sony. So that was a big acquisition of a very big company, a very well regarded company, but it is also emblematic of what Sony now does in terms of the games that it looks to produce, and that is that it wants to do the big blockbuster stuff almost exclusively. It's not to say that the company doesn't do creative games. You've got Dreams that's coming soon enough, and there's a fair bit of stuff that it's doing on the PlayStation VR platform because budgets can't be as high in terms of the games that you develop on that platform, given that the audiences aren't as big. But in terms of the actual console, the PlayStation console itself, Sony's focus is very much on those big blockbuster games in the last couple of years. So there's Uncharted, obviously, The Last of Us is coming, Ghosts of Tsushima, there is what was released earlier this year, Days Gone is the name of it, mental blank there for a second, and Spider-Man itself, of course. So those are predominantly what Sony is now producing. Whereas back with the PlayStation 3, towards the later half of it anyway, and the PlayStation 4, the company was much more experimental in terms of the games that it brought on. I'm not sure if you quite remember some of these, but a couple of the more noteworthy ones include Rain, which was on the PlayStation 3. I loved Rain. Puppeteer, which was a clever little platformer with a puppet aesthetic. That was also a PlayStation 3 title. There was The Unfinished Swan, which was on PlayStation 3 and then later ported to PlayStation 4. Entwined, which is the game that you're seeing here in front of you. That was a E3 surprise drop early in the PlayStation 4's life. And there's also Bound, which was a platformer that focused on gymnastics as an aesthetic. Ballet and gymnastics as an aesthetic. And plenty of other games as well in that kind of vein. That was what Sony was really doing a lot of. And it's one of those things that the console manufacturers all kind of go in these cycles where when they're at the top of the market, when they're the number one publisher, they tend to be much more conservative in that they go for the big blockbusters, the big numbers, and don't take on the smaller experimental projects. Certainly we saw that Microsoft did that when it was riding high with the Xbox 360, and Nintendo's often been accused of being too heavily reliant on its mainstay games when it has been at the top as well. But we see with both Nintendo and Microsoft that the things are changing a little bit. Microsoft has been on a big acquisition spree, picking up developers, but not big developers, not like Insomniac, much smaller and creative developers like Compulsion Games and Ninja Theory and so on. And Nintendo, of course, has been investing very heavily in some very creative games like Astral Chain, which was recently released, and it has a whole range of other kind of more experimental and new IPs that it has created or invested in over the last generation. So both of those companies are trying to catch Sony. They're trying to find the new thing. They're trying to find new audiences and new creative experiences, which is what's driving some of their investments in terms of the games that they're creating. Sony doesn't need to do that, of course, because Sony's already at the top. What Sony's looking to do is to more maintain its presence in the market, and it's doing that largely through big blockbuster games. You can't really fault Sony for doing that. Of course you can't, because Sony's main job is to make sure that people are buying PlayStation 4s, or in the future PlayStation 5s, and at a time where it's hard for developers to justify making exclusives for any platform, Sony really needs to produce those itself, and the best way to make sure that the maximum number of people want to buy a console is make sure that the exclusives on it are the big blockbuster, big ticket items that people will buy a whole console for just to play. Sony knows that if it has those players, then the third-party developers are going to come to the platform anyway, because it's just such a big number. And we've certainly seen that with the PlayStation 4, where there's a huge range of games on the console, and Sony hasn't had to insist on any of them being exclusive or invest in any of them to make them exclusive, because they've just naturally appeared on there, and then people already have the console because of Sony's blockbuster strategy. So it's not a strategy that's I would in any way criticize, but it is unfortunate simply because when Sony has invested in these kinds of creative, smaller projects, no one really had an eye for games quite like Sony. And it was one of my favorite publishers for a long time, because it just kept finding stuff like Entwined here, which is a game that doesn't use a mechanic that... it's a game that uses a mechanic that isn't by any means unusual. All it is a dual stick kind of coordination game where you need to make sure your left and right are working in concert. That kind of thing we've actually seen quite a few times before, but it's in the presentation that the game found its unique quality and was really such a special game to play. And Sony was really good at finding those. The Unfinished Swan, for example, did a great job of the aesthetic of the black and white, and again was a fairly simple game to play, but was really emotive and original and creative and very artistic. And as anybody who watches my YouTube enough knows, that I really enjoy the kind of artistic experiences. Bound here is another great example. It's a very simple platformer. It's it's not a walking simulator, but it is a very simple platformer where you just need to move through the levels, solve some very basic puzzles, and avoid some enemies. But nothing too stressful. Where the game was really special was in the way that it presented itself, the story that it told, and the emotion and the aesthetics and all of those kinds of things. It was a very artful game. So Sony was very good at finding that stuff, and we still see it a little bit when Sony does have the ability to back an experimental project. I mean, Concrete Genie, for example, looks really gorgeous, looks very much like that kind of creative Sony vibe. And on the PlayStation VR, where the numbers are not as big, so Sony needs to just get stuff on there, but doesn't necessarily have the same budgets to work with that it does with its console, we see a lot of that creative stuff as well. So Moss is a good example of that. Very low budget, very simple game, but very beautifully done, very creative, very artistic. Another good example is, I can't pronounce the name of it, unfortunately. It's the title from Software, that kind of investigative one on PlayStation VR. Those kinds of games are the kinds of games that I like to play, and it's nice to see when Sony can back them. And for a long time on the PlayStation 3 especially, Sony was one of my favorite publishers precisely because of these kinds of games. So will we see a return of this kind of Sony with these kinds of small experimental projects that it backs at a frequent rate? Possibly not, I want to say. I think fortunes of game publishers rise and fall, and with that so too does the strategy in terms of the games that they publish. But I think Sony's in a place now where it's not going to need these kinds of games for quite a while, if ever again. Part of the reason being that it is much more a single platform focused company now. It has the VR, of course, but it's not like back when it had PlayStation VR and PSP to support, where it had multiple platforms that it needed to get games on. And that was part of the reason it split the budgets a bit, so it was able to support both of those platforms, so it would invest in some smaller projects. And we saw that especially with the PlayStation Vita, where Sony found a fair few, PlayStation Vita and PSP, where Sony found a fair few of its creative game ideas, like Patapon here that you're seeing now, or Gravity Rush or so on. Those games would later make their way to the PlayStation 4 and so on, and they have their fan bases, but they're more small experimental titles. Those only happened because Sony had that handheld that it needed to support and it didn't have the budgets to work with on that handheld that it did with the PlayStation itself. And to an extent that will apply to VR as well, but we don't know how far Sony plans on investing in VR going forwards. As a technology, it seems to be one that is getting close to being superseded by AR experiences anyway, and there's only a certain audience for VR. So I would suspect that obviously the main console will continue to be the focus for Sony, and the way that Sony looks to support that is through a fewer number of very big budget games, following the same model that EA and Activision and Ubisoft are all following as well. So just being exclusive because it's Sony. But in doing so, just like with Activision, EA and Ubisoft, you see less and less of those small creative experiments. The same will be applied to Sony. Again, this is not to criticize Sony on any level. I think Sony's doing an amazing job with what it needs to grow its audience and to give people, its fans, the kinds of games that they want to play. You only need to look at the success of God of War and The Last of Us, and no doubt the upcoming Ghost of Tsushima and Last of Us 2 will have much the same impact. It says a lot where Days Gone is considered one of the lesser games in the Sony catalogue, but it has it still had a huge following, and it was still celebrated by a lot of players as well as a big budget game. So Sony's doing everything right. And it is still creating those smaller games as well. As I mentioned before, Concrete Genie's coming up, and it looks like a gorgeous little title. And there's also Erica, which Sony dropped as a surprise at Gamescom. So it still has a bit of that heritage, but it's just a change in business model. I can say that, you know, I wish that there were more games like Rain and Puppeteer. I think the amazing creativity that was on show with that was a big reason that I love the PlayStation 3 so much. And like I said, Sony was one of my favorite publishers. I do wish that that kind of thing is still being done by Sony, but you know, business models need to evolve as times change, and Sony is the leader in the market. So that's a bit of a brain dump. I'm still scratching for content while I'm over in Japan, which is part of the reason that I did this video. It's kind of timeless and I can put it out there whenever without having to worry too much about it. But it is something that I have wanted to talk about for a while, because I am such a fan of what Sony was doing about a generation ago. And it's not to say I'm disappointed with where things are at now, it's just that it is different, and I wanted to celebrate some of those earlier games in Sony's catalogue. If you have a PlayStation 3 and can check out stuff like Rain and Puppeteer, I hugely recommend you do if you haven't already. And the PlayStation 4 has a number of really great games from the earlier months and years of its release that you should probably investigate if your PlayStation 4 is a newer one. Patapon here is a great one. You would have seen Bound before, Entwined. There are plenty of great games that Sony has produced that are not as talked about now because they're a bit older and they were a bit niche when they came out. I recommend you check them out as well. Thank you very much as always for tuning in to my videos. I hope this was interesting. I hope it helped you find at least one new game to play if you haven't already. And yeah, please do back me on Patreon if you enjoy my videos. I always ask that it does help. And I would like to do a lot more videos, and the Patreon backing will certainly help me do that. Otherwise, please do check out digitallydownloaded.net, where I do a lot of written coverage of all my stuff as well. And other than that, we will see you at the next video.